Let's get peppy. This is episode number 80 of PEP. This is where you go to see what's not in the show. I got a rhyme in there, Dave. Do you like that? I made the effort to actually write a slogan. Do you like the slogan?
That's great. That's so Dr. Seuss-like that I'm sure you're going to get cancelled soon. Or actually, only the early episodes of PEP.
It would be hilarious if this was the thing in my career that got me cancelled.
Terrible Dr. Seuss rhyming.
Yes. But anyway, the show I'm talking about is Play America, which you can see on iView or on Facebook if you're interested, on Play America, ABC Play America page. Otherwise, you can see us. I am Chaz Lichadello. This is Dr. Dave, the doctor with the mostest. Tell us what you're a doctor in, Dave.
I am an associate professor in American politics and foreign policy, and I'm at the University of Sydney.
It sounds very relevant to me. And I'm a guy who's got a great deal in bulk buying of T-shirts. Let's get right into it. Let's kick off with a topic which I know Dave was so heavily invested in last time. I know he's going to want to start off with it this time. And that is Biden's approval rating. We're going to talk about this now every single week. No. I just wanted to say one thing about this, and then I'm going to throw to you about polls generally, because I know you've got some other polls that aren't Biden's approval rating. The reason I want to bring up, first of all, it's still dropping. The latest YouGov poll had Biden at 39% approval, 50% disapproval. Now, the average is higher than that, but still, that's not great. But for those unlike Dave who actually care about that, I just want to point out one thing, which I saw, which was interesting about this, I think, and that there was a Navigator poll about Biden's approval rating, which was also in the low 40s. They broke it up on a partisan basis. And it was quite interesting that the net approval of Biden overall had dropped 8 points in the last month, according to this Navigator poll. It dropped 13 points amongst Democrats, from net approval plus 79 to net approval plus 66. It dropped 14 points amongst independents. It gone from minus 11 net approval to minus 25. It dropped 19 points amongst Hispanics, plus 25 to plus 6, and 30 points amongst the insurance company better known as AAPI, that's what they call Asians and Pacific Islanders, plus 51 down to plus 21. So my point is, the fact that he dropped 13 points amongst Democrats and 30 points amongst AAPI, 19 points amongst Hispanics, that means it's going to rebound fast. As soon as there is some kind of good news, you get out of this funk where everyone's having to go with him about Afghanistan and the middle of the Delta strain, all that kind of stuff. If America emerges from this shadowy period here, you would expect him to rebound fast given those numbers there. The question is, are they going to be emerging from this shadowy period soon? Because these things do tend to spiral. Dave, what do you want to say about either that or other polls?
Okay. First of all, I'm going to add a book to the reading list, and I actually want you to read it, Chaz. By John Zaller. It's called The Nature and Origins of Mass Opinion, and it's written in 1992, a highly influential book on the study of public opinion. And it really gets into what are people actually doing when they are answering surveys and where are they getting their answers from. And one of the things that this book really teases out is what Zaller calls top-of-the-head survey responses, which is the idea that, quite reasonably, people answer survey questions according to the most immediately accessible information that they have. And so that's going to be things that they have heard or thought about recently. And obviously, everything that's happening recently is bad, okay? You've got this absolute despondency that has been brought on by there seemed to be so much hope in the first 6 months of the year about where the pandemic was going. That has now been reversed. You've got American defeat in Afghanistan, okay? There is no other way of putting it. Defeat in Afghanistan. I was talking to a friend in Dayton, Ohio this morning, and she pointed out that at least at the moment throughout the United States, people are still able to go outside and enjoy the weather. And even where there are COVID restrictions, that at least allows you to have a normal semblance of a social life. As the weather gets colder in many parts of the United States, even that is going to disappear. And it's still going to be a long time before COVID is beaten. Hence the fact that Biden is announcing new mask mandates today, which that's not going to make him any more popular. So just everything at the moment is not only is it creating a very unfavourable public opinion environment for someone like Biden, it is probably going to get worse, as you were banging on about. Yes, and I completely agree with you that there's likely to be a recovery when good news comes along, but that good news, unless there's some kind of surprise, could be a little while off, is what I'm suggesting. But looking at things over the sort of longer term, there was some very interesting polling that came out, and so interesting I'm now blanking on exactly where it came from, but I think it's ABC Washington Post, asking the question of, did 9/11 change the country for the better or worse? Now, this is a question that's been asked every year since 2002. In 2002, the majority of Americans thought that 9/11 had changed the country for the better, okay? Because remember, this is at a time when it was believed that 9/11 had unified the country and had created this real sense of purpose and had reminded people of what mattered. And this was when the war in Afghanistan appeared to be going very well, and this was before the war in Iraq had begun. And this is the same year where, for the first time, well, for the last time in 40 years, there was actually an instance of the party in the White House gaining seats at the midterms. That's how high everyone was on public opinion. Bush's approval rating was 80 or 90%. Now, 10 years ago, when that question was asked, it was line ball. About 50% of people said that the country had changed for the better. About 50% of the people said the country had changed for the worse. This was at a time when there was increasing consciousness of these wars are not going very well, Afghanistan and Iraq. In fact, the US was in the process of getting out of Iraq. But also there was a sense of this has saddled the country with a massively expanded national security state, still in evidence, even though it's many years since there was a terrorist attack on American soil. Now the question is asked, and a clear majority of people say that the country has actually changed for the worse. And I think that looking at that long-term trend of that question does actually tell us a lot more about the United States and where it's at than the kind of standard horse race public opinion polls. I think that there is actually a recognition of where the last 20 years has led to the United States. And the fact that the United States is now withdrawing from Afghanistan in what once again is a clear defeat, first of all shows us that the basic aims of the war on terror were not achieved. And even though there has been no foreign terrorist attack on American soil, there have been plenty of instances of what's become known as domestic terrorism, as the country has become more and more violently divided and polarized. There is certainly a consciousness that in the foreign war on terror that's been lost, that essentially the 9/11 attacks invited the United States into these wars, which in retrospect it was bound to lose in Iraq and Afghanistan at the cost of thousands of American lives, of trillions of American dollars, and of course, millions of Iraqi and Afghan lives, which has had the effect of making the US probably less unpopular with the rest of the world than it has been for a very long time. So I think that there is a real consciousness around that question, even if it's not, even if people aren't sort of making specific causal links, that things just have gone really wrong in the last 20 years, that the country is way more polarized and divided than it was before, that there is certainly no clear agreement on what the big questions are, let alone what the big answers are, something that one section of the country thinks is a real problem, like the pandemic or climate change, another part of the country doesn't think is a problem at all. But there's certainly a sense, everyone can think, no matter where they are on the political spectrum, everyone has reasons to think that things have actually got worse. And yes, you would expect Democrats to be happier now that, Joe Biden is in office. But I think still the main reference point for Democrats in terms of how things have gone over the last 20 years is the fact that the country ended up with Trump in office for 4 years. So nobody has a lot of reason to be happy about this, and everybody has got reasons to think that the country's actually got worse.
So the irony of this for me is that while I think it's indisputable that America was worse off after 9/11, like just purely from the war on terror, if nothing else, just purely from Afghanistan, Iran, and the surveillance security state alone, it's worse off. I feel like the things that people are thinking about now, when they're talking about all the things that are screwed up now, they're not from 9/11. Until a month ago, until the Afghanistan withdrawal, I thought actually one of the few things that there was cross-partisan, I wouldn't say unity, but cross-partisan understanding about was people's position on terror. Like people generally were thinking it's time to leave Afghanistan. People generally were saying Iraq was a mistake. People generally were thinking about withdrawing from conflagrations around the world and generally, apart from Lindsey Graham who wanted to bomb everything, were trying to tamp down that kind of stuff a little bit. I felt like until recently, now it's become more partisan again since the withdrawal, but until a month ago, I felt like there was the closest thing to unity on terror issues. But all the things that are screwed up, I think have come from the recession, from the GFC. I think. I think that the last 4 years of the Obama administration, which people got so angry about, and the Trump years and what's going on now, I think this is all a direct line from the GFC myself, not 9/11. But I feel like 9/11 is taking the blame for the GFC's issues.
You might be right about that, but I mean, this is another thing about the way that people answer survey questions is that people do tend to conflate issues together, and so I think the GFC is in many ways more consequential than 9/11, and I think that it's the GFC that has been responsible for a real shift in people's economic thinking. Like I think that sort of standard Reagan Thatcher style let free markets do their job type thinking, which I think used to be the dominant strain of thought in the US, is a long way from being at least as dominant as it was, even if it's still the reigning ideology of the elite. I think that the GFC really pushed people both to the left and to the parts of the right that are very sceptical of free markets and of big business. So yes, I do think that was highly consequential. But at the same time, I think that people just would see it as part of this continuum of things that have gone wrong since 9/11. And also, I mean, I think another thing is that the polarization that we see now didn't begin with 9/11. It began long before that. And as I've said many times before, I think that the advent of what we might call hyperpolarization began with Bill Clinton. But I do think that polarization, that all of the circumstances of 9/11 contributed to polarization, especially if you remember the atmosphere in the lead up to the Iraq War, where the sort of this constant vocabulary of traitors and un-American and anti-American really came back into vogue and has never gone out of vogue, was very easily sort of repackaged by the Tea Party and then again by Trump supporters. So I do think that that's contributed to that as well.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Before we go into Congress, I always want to say one little thing about the polling, about the effects that. But last week when we were talking about polling, I was saying, Mike, the reason I was bringing it up was because the effect it could have on Congress. And we saw one example of that this week, actually. David Chipman, who was nominated to be the director of the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms Bureau, and he's like, he's a hardcore gun controller, right? He works for the Giffords group, and he's as far as gun control goes, he's right up there. He's been battered around from pillar to post by the Senate for the last 5 months. The Republicans won't have a bar of him, obviously, but even some of the Democrats, Manchin, John Tester, there's 1 or 2 others who had some problems with him as well, but they haven't withdrawn him. They've just kept on going, and we're going to keep on going, and keep on going, and they have a tendency to do this. They try to push through if they possibly can. Well, yesterday, they withdrew his nomination. And the only thing that's changed between now and a month ago is Joe Biden's polling's dropped. And I reckon that's the reason why. I just think they've just given up trying to prosecute his case because they know that they've got less chips with Congress at the moment. So they're just not even going to try. Just worry about the things that they need to worry about, like the bills and so forth. So anyway, I reckon that's an example of how you just start to get these little things where they just don't have as much sway with Congress and they stop trying in some things and they become less ambitious and it becomes a bit of a spiral. But anyway, we'll see about that.
I'm yet to be convinced.
So what?
I'm yet to be convinced.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. I'll keep on bringing up stuff as I see it. Don't worry. It's time, though, for a little quick break before we go into more Congress with our
Stats Nugget.
Pew poll here. 48% of people now want the government to restrict misinformation. Okay, now, the key word there is government.
Yes.
There was 39% back in 2018, now it's 48%, so it's gone up. The percentage of people who thought social media companies should curb misinformation went from 56% in 2018 to 59% today. So that's barely changed. The people who said social media should restrict misinformation.
Yeah.
But the people who say government should restrict it has gone up 9%. In 2018, it was 37% Republicans and 40% Democrats. So it was basically across the board saying the same things. Now it's 28% Republicans and 65% Democrats. Now that's not a massive surprise because at the moment it's Republicans who are associated with misinformation. And so they're less keen to restrict it. And Democrats are making more of this kind of thing.
And also Democrats are in control of every branch of government.
Great point. Great point.
I can imagine there would have been a lot of Democrats who wouldn't have wanted the Trump administration to control misinformation.
Excellent point. Now, also, we should point out that this is, polls aside, a flat-out violation of the First Amendment. The government is not in a position to restrict any kind of speech. Now, social media companies can. Oh, jump in there, Dave.
Not so sure about that. You could definitely make the argument that there are brands of misinformation that reach the shouting fire in a crowded theatre threshold, especially and also the other thing that has changed in this is the pandemic.
Yep.
Right. Blatant misinformation. Of the most blatant kind, i.e. medically incorrect information about vaccines will make you sterile, you should drink hydroxychloroquine from your fish tank or whatever. A lot of people would regard that as that's shouting fire in a crowded theatre, right? That's actually that is just utterances that are directly threatening to public safety.
I understand the argument. Do you think the Supreme Court would agree with that argument?
Not necessarily, especially not this Supreme Court.
That's what I'm referring to, yes.
But what I'm saying is when you say it's flagrantly unconstitutional, that is not how a lot of people would see it.
Okay. All right, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. I understand your point. I understand you're distinguishing between the practical situation we're in at the moment and what is legally desirable. I understand. Yeah. Okay, I'll go on with the.
But also, I mean, there are laws against false advertising.
Are there?
Yeah.
I think there are restrictions on false advertising because of the because I think there's restrictions on whether you can be on the spectrum. You can use the government spectrum with false advertising, but do you go to jail for false advertising? I'm not sure there's criminal laws against it, are there?
Don't know. This is homework.
Yes, it sounds like it. Okay.
I am remembered of that great moment in the Fire Festival documentary where there's a conference call the morning afterwards with all the people who were responsible for the Fire Festival. And Jarul says, look, let's not overreact here. No one got killed. And someone says, we committed fraud. And Jarul says, no, not fraud. False advertising, maybe. Anyway, I am just saying there are certain types of speech that the government restricts. And
there are definitely some kinds of speech that the government restricts. That is true.
And I think that a lot of people would see regulating misinformation as falling into that category.
Some people, well, I would
especially medical misinformation.
I would
maybe
say
even
39% of people would. Sorry, what?
I don't know. I am reminded that I actually know nothing about the law.
Yes.
But plenty of people who listen to this show do, and even you actually do know something about the law. So I'm going to stop. No,
that's okay. That's okay. Look, I think you may, I'm sure they'll argue in the comments. I will look at the comments, and if anyone says anything interesting, I'll bring it back next week, and I'll have a look myself at false advertising. I'm not sure that is against the law.
I will not look at the comments. I, in fact, welcome the Australian government, the Australian High Court's decision this week to hold media companies responsible.
That's such a terrible decision.
No, I think it's a great decision.
Sorry, say decision. For those that
okay, so this is going into Australian content here. So following on from Dylan Voller suing media companies 4 years ago for defamatory comments that were published on their Facebook pages, the High Court has found that these companies are, in fact, responsible. They are, in fact, the publishers of the comments that are on their Facebook pages because they invite people to comment. First of all, I think analytically, that is absolutely true. Second, these companies, and I mean, it is well known that the only way that these companies feel that they can make money these days is by appealing to the kind of psychopaths who are going to hang around their Facebook pages for hours on end. And the way that they do that is through engagement through the comment section. I'm not saying anything bad about our comment section. I think our comment section is great, but I think it is fairly well known that media companies deliberately invite psychopathy in their comment sections. And so the effect of this could be actually getting rid of comment sections altogether. Not our comment section, of course, but most comment sections on most Facebook pages, good. The world will be better off without them.
So, yeah, this is one where we disagree because I would say, I mean, look, I got all kinds of issues with social media, absolutely. But in terms of like making money out of comments, they make money out of comments on their web pages, which are their responsibility, the comments on those things. They do have to moderate them. They don't make money out of the comments on their Facebook page. Like you don't get advertising dollars from the comments on your Facebook page.
What I'm suggesting is one of the reasons why people go to their stories in the first place is to comment on.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. Yeah,
I mean so the kinds of people who are attracted to click on something in the first place is great. I get to comment on this. Okay, yes, some of them are decent, good faith citizens who want to engage in the marketplace of ideas with others. But the ones that they're making money out of are the psychos.
Look, I'm not going to argue with you about psychos. There are definitely a lot of psychos, and they tend to dominate. When there is a psycho, they tend to dominate a comment section. I know that better than anyone. But I just think it's sad. I think people already feel disenfranchised enough, and this is only going to lead to no more comments. And then people will feel more disenfranchised. And yes, it will stop the psychos having a platform. That is true.
Yeah.
But it will stop a lot of other people having a platform as well. And I think that's...
They might actually have to go and talk to people or something. But something that's worth mentioning there is Australian defamation law in the largest states in the country actually changed this year in July in terms of you can't sue straight away in the same way that Voller's lawyers actually did in 2017. Now you actually have to give the offending party a month to remove the comment. So that might actually be what happens. And even prior to this, often this was the strategy that plaintiffs wanted to pursue first, giving someone the chance to remove comments. The problem was, prior to this case in the High Court, the media companies couldn't even be held responsible to that degree.
Okay.
Right? Lawyers couldn't even go to the media companies and say, remove this or we'll sue. So I think this is a good decision.
That's an important clarification. If what happens is you get a complaint and you have, I don't think you need a month. If you have a day to moderate a complaint, then I'm okay with that. Like that, I don't have a problem with that. That won't be the end of comments. That'll just mean someone's got to do a couple of minutes work a day. Okay, so we might be on common ground there. Just to finish off this little stats nugget, because this is the longest stats nugget ever. This is a stats boulder. In 2018, this is the demographics of this is really interesting. In 2018, older Americans and those with less education were more likely than younger and more educated adults to say the US government should take steps to restrict false information online. But now, Americans across all age groups are basically on the same page. They have the same proportions. Like it's moved from old people and people who don't understand what's going on to everyone's on the same page. So, which is interesting. It's a case of, I think the community is coming round. Even though I disagree with it, I think the community have
once again, the community is coming around to disagreeing with Chaz.
Exactly. Let's move on though. Just briefly on, actually I'll tell you what, given the time, we've got like 50 minutes left, which is a lot of time. We've got a lot to cover. I'm going to skip Congress because we mentioned Congress on the show. If we have time at the end, I'll come back to Congress. You don't want to say anything about Joe Manchin desperately, do you?
No.
I didn't think so. I know you want to talk about the Robert E. Lee statue. Do you want to get that in now?
Yeah, so the Robert E. Lee statue has come down in Richmond, Virginia. And I mean, this is pretty significant because there were arguments about removing this statue decades before this became a nationwide issue. So the fact that it has finally come down now is a very significant thing. I do remember when the debates first started, the nationwide debates first started about removing statues and removing monuments. Richmond, Virginia was often sort of given as the example of, well, if you're going to remove monuments, you're going to get rid of the entirety of downtown Richmond, Virginia. The whole place is basically a monument to the Confederacy. So the fact that this has happened in Richmond, Virginia is highly significant. It did have the hilarious consequence of Donald Trump commented on this. And the way that Donald Trump has been willing to make himself like literally the most pro-Confederate person in the country. You know, he's the one who doesn't want military bases named after Confederate officials to change their names, even when the military wants it. You know, he really is setting himself up as the leader of the lost cause, which is not very surprising. And he was lamenting the removal of this. He says it's recognised as a beautiful bronze sculpture. Now, no, it's not. It's important to understand the distinction between a sculpture and a statue, right? A statue is a political statement, generally with very little artistic merit. A sculpture is an artistic expression. Now, not that there's a difference necessarily between artistic expression and political statements. A lot of things can be both. But in sculptures, the priority is on the artistic expression. A statue is a political statement about who we value, about who's in charge of the country. Because right throughout history, statues have been put up and removed according to what the political winds of the time are. So if there's a place with a bunch of Confederate statues up that were, first of all, not erected in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, they were erected at the height of Jim Crow to make a political statement about who was in charge. If those fucking things are still up, that's making a statement about who is still in charge of the country and who we still value in the country. So the removal of statues is a fantastic thing. Look, you know, and I realise I'm in a minority on this. I would actually remove every statue in the world if I had the chance, including the ones that I agree with, because I think that they're terrible.
What about all of Melbourne's public art? Would you remove all of them as well?
No. Art is fine. The sculptures are great.
Yeah, sure.
More sculptures, less statues is what I say. But then, okay, that wasn't the best part of Trump's statement. Trump went on to say that if America had a genius like Robert E. Lee commanding its forces in Afghanistan, then it would have won the war in its totality a long time ago. Might I remind everyone that Robert E. Lee lost the Civil War? Okay? And I mean, Jeet here had a good article about this on his Substack. He points out that the aristocratic military caste has always actually venerated these figures who lost, but who fulfilled the aristocratic warrior ideal. People like Robert E. Lee or Erwin Rommel or I'm blanking on the German naval commander, but they always love him as well. So, yeah, he lost. Like, he would have lost in Afghanistan too. One of the reasons also, according to Jeet here, why he won so many battles, at least early on, was because he was fighting in Virginia. He was fighting in terrain that he understood very well. Once the war moved out of Virginia, he started to lose increasingly. So fighting in Afghanistan, why the fuck am I even arguing?
Let's just settle this and put up some Robert E. Lee statues in Afghanistan. That's the common ground, isn't it? The middle ground. That's then they can learn about our history. I love the way Trump was always going about, we're going to figure out history. We're censoring our history. Like, the entire history book is what's on a statue. Yeah,
Nobody ever learnt history from a statue. You can learn a lot about the current political environment from which statues are allowed to stand, but nobody ever learned about history from a statue.
Anyway,
what you learn about history from is books, something that Trump is famously opposed to.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it?
Yes.
Let's move on. We spoke at length about the Texas abortion law last week, but I just couldn't process how bad this law was, and there was all kinds of stuff that I learned afterwards that were even worse. So I just want to bring up a few of them now, and then we'll go into some of the politics because it's continued on since then.
Yeah.
First of all, the way you tell if an abortion is suable under this law, and I emphasize suable, not illegal, because abortion is still legal in Texas beyond 6 weeks, according to the Supreme Court. You can sue people for having an abortion past 6 weeks, but it's still not actually against the law, according to the Supreme Court. Now, obviously, they're going to probably overturn that law very soon, but it's just funny the way the Texas has just proceed on as if it's now illegal, when it's actually, strictly speaking, not. But anyway, the way you can tell if an abortion is suable under this law is if physicians check for cardiac activity with a sonogram prior to the abortion and they sense some kind of cardiac activity, all right? Now, there's arguments about whether it's a heartbeat or not a heartbeat. I'm not interested in that. The fact is that what this law says is that the abortion practitioner needs to conduct a sonogram to check, and if they do and they perceive some kind of cardiac activity, then you're not allowed to have that abortion according to this process. Or at least you can be sued. You can be sued. So I don't think you're allowed to, but you can be sued. Okay. Now, what that means, I'll just read the quote from the law. A physician may not knowingly perform or induce an abortion if he detects a fetal heartbeat. Okay, fine. But if you remember, this law is about people who aid and abet the abortion practitioners.
Yes.
So those people don't know if the doctor is going to perform a sonogram. They don't know if the doctor is going to perform a sonogram and find cardiac activity when they're performing the activity that later becomes aiding and abetting, which means you could, strictly speaking, under this law, be sued for $10,000 for an activity that you have no idea, and you can have no idea is going to lead to you being liable. That's what's complete. That's one of the most ridiculous things about this law. If you are the classic example of the Uber driver, which everyone keeps on mentioning, I mentioned it last week as well, you don't know if the doctor's going to perform a sonogram on that pregnant lady that you're taking to the clinic, but you can still be sued if the doctor doesn't. That is absolutely outrageous. Now,
You might not even know what a sonogram is.
Yeah, totally. Now, I know that the Uber driver is very unlikely to be sued under this law because this law is specifically about shutting down abortion clinics. That's why it's there, right?
Yeah.
Pragmatically. But still, the law is the law. It's written there that people can do that. And if you don't want that to be a possibility, then don't put it in the law. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, along those same lines, the law says someone can be sued under the aiding and abetting provision, quote, regardless of whether the person knew or should have known that the abortion was illegal. So it doesn't matter if they're completely ignorant. They can still be sued. On this stupid law. Ignorance of the particulars, no excuse whatsoever. Your only defence is if you, quote, reasonably believed after conducting a reasonable investigation that the abortion was legal. So what that means is that sets everyone potentially against each other, constantly launching reasonable investigations against pregnant women to ensure that you're not liable for $10,000 at least. And so Texas has created this scenario where everyone is at each other, and out of fear of what might happen, because that fear is a reasonable fear because there are already whistleblower websites which they're trying to get up. They haven't gotten them up yet because I'll get to that in a second. But they're trying to get whistleblower websites where if anyone sees anything that could potentially be subject to this lawsuit, they dob that person into the website, and then Texas Right to Life starts suing them. So that's the environment. We're creating this snitchy kind of, this is the kind of thing which, in a different context, people would start throwing around Nazi analogies. And I'm not throwing around a Nazi analogy, but I'm saying it is ridiculous that we got this everyone up against each other.
Can I just say, getting back to the point of 9/11 making the country worse?
Yeah.
Yeah, suddenly everyone in Texas could be subject to what American Muslims have been subject to for the last 20 years.
That is true. That is true, although I would suggest that the risk here is probably higher because they're really on high alert here. But you make a good point. Absolutely. Yeah. The next thing is when a woman has a miscarriage, and a lot of them do, in, say, the 12-week range, that's very common. It's very common to have miscarriages, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, 13 weeks. Okay, you need to have the remaining fetal tissue removed from your body because it can get infected.
Yes.
Now, to those who don't know what they're talking about, that can look very much like an abortion.
Yep.
It's a lady who was pregnant walking into a clinic and then walking out after they've removed a whole bunch of fetal tissue. Who is going to take the risk of performing that operation when they know they could be subject to nuisance lawsuits?
Yeah, and more broadly, it turns every potential miscarriage into potentially into some kind of vindictive investigation of, was this actually an abortion?
Yeah, totally. Now the lady herself cannot be sued, but everyone around her can be.
Yeah.
So once again, it just raises the stakes. It just makes being pregnant incredibly unpleasant, even if you don't want an abortion. It makes everything you do as far as the people around you are concerned, a potential cause for them to get sued somewhere down the track. So that's another problem there. Another thing, I told you how the person suing can claim legal costs if they win, but they don't have to pay the legal costs if they lose. You're not going to believe this, or you will believe it, but it's just shocking. It turns out that provision is much broader than I thought. That provision also covers any challenges to any Texas law that regulates or restricts abortion. So anyone trying to challenge any Texas pro-abortion law for any reasons whatsoever is guaranteed to get financially punished, even if they win. And then there's teenagers, which I just brushed right past last week. But that's a whole different thing because they already face ridiculous restrictions in Texas. I mean, first of all women must have 2 appointments with the same doctor, no less than 24 hours apart. The first appointment must include a sonogram. They must be forced to read their pro-life propaganda, information pamphlet. The second appointment must be with the same doctor, and it's got to be, and it's usually during work or school hours. So that might take some time to organise for you and the doctor to be available at the same time. That's all women, right? But then teenagers must also get explicit parental permission for abortion and also contraception, by the way. You might not know that. They need to bring the parent in to give that explicit parental permission. Can you imagine how hard that might be? Or they need to get a notarized consent form, which is also going to be quite hard. Bear in mind, they might only know they're pregnant for a week before they're out of the window here, right? Or maybe 2 weeks, if they're lucky. So all of this is likely to take more than a week or two, especially for a nervous teenager. Or you can get a court order granting you a bypass. This is what a court order involves. If they proceed immediately, the judge has 5 days to schedule the hearing, right? Bear in mind the clock is ticking. And then they appoint lawyers and guardians and all that kind of stuff, which also takes more time. If the judge rejects the petition for whatever reason, they can lodge an appeal. Then the next judge has another 5 days before that hearing. And any judge can just reject it completely without even a hearing. They don't even have to have a hearing. Just fuck you. Obviously, remember, the teenagers are very unlikely to afford the money or have the time to go into state as well, obviously. So this is the world that's confronting teenagers if they are trying to get an abortion. And let's not forget the kids in foster care or the kids who are in immigration detention centres who have no parents. So they need to go through the court process as well. For particularly teenagers, this is really very, very likely for them to end up not being able to go through the process before the 6 weeks is up. So there's all that as well. Now, I want to emphasise that 2 or 3 week thing, the fact that 6 weeks is not long enough, because Greg Abbott is really making a big thing about that. You might have seen this clip during the week, which was much mocked for an obvious reason, but I'm going to focus on the bit that hasn't been much mocked.
Why force a rape or incest victim to carry a pregnancy to term?
It doesn't require that at all, because obviously it provides at least 6 weeks for a person to be able to get an abortion. And so for one, it doesn't provide that. That said, however, let's make something very clear. Rape is a crime, and Texas will work tirelessly to make sure that we eliminate all rapists from the streets of Texas by aggressively going out and arresting them and prosecuting them and getting them off the streets. So goal number 1 in the state of Texas is to eliminate rape so that no woman, no person will be a victim of rape. But in addition to that, we do want to make sure that we provide support for those who are victims of rape. And we have organizations that we as a state support, that others support, to make sure that anybody who's victimized that will get the support they need.
Full grab there, as you can see, is not him saying solely, oh, no problems, we'll just eliminate rape, which is how he's been presented, right? He's not that dumb. But he tried to get an applause line out of that in the middle of an answer about rape victims, which is kind of embarrassing. And his key point, really, his key point there is you've got 6 weeks. That's his key point. That's his key point to rape victims. You got 6 weeks. You got heaps of time. 6 weeks. But it's not 6 weeks. It's 1 week, 2 weeks, or 0. And so I think that's very, very important that people understand that. Okay. Now, there's a number of lawsuits going on with this, just very quickly. The Department of Justice have a lawsuit. I haven't had time to read about that. That just came through a couple of hours ago. From the little I saw from the New York Times article about this, it seemed to me that they made no attempt to deal with the legal loophole at all, which means they're probably going to lose. But maybe the New York Times misreported that. I'll have to have a look at it properly, the actual lawsuit itself.
And I just, another thing about that Abbott grab is he's talking getting rapists off the street. That is not the context in which most rape occurs.
Yeah, it's domestic.
Exactly,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's, I mean, I can tell why he believed that would be an applause line, because that's classic Republican law and order stuff. The threat is racially coded out in the street, and we're going to clean up the street. But anyway, there's there's too much to point out about what is wrong, not only with this law but with all the rhetoric surrounding it.
Absolutely, but even though the department, just to finish off the legal bit, even though the Department of Justice lawsuit may be dismissed, it's only a matter of time till someone. Also, a Texas judge has frozen any attempts to enforce this so far while they go through these issues. At some point in time, someone is going to enforce it, and they'll enforce it 1 second after they are allowed to. You've got some right-wingers who are just spoiling to enforce this thing. So, and the moment someone tries to enforce it, then it will go properly through the proper court process to the Supreme Court, undoubtedly, and it will be enjoined until then. So, I mean, realistically, this is not the case that's going to determine abortion. It's going to be the Mississippi one, the Dobbs one, which is going to be heard in a couple of months, and it will be next year that they hear that. But yeah, this is definitely one attracting all the noise at the moment, and the one that's attracting all the publicity, and the one that both sides are trying to leverage political advantage out of, which I think you wanted to say something about, yeah?
Well, yes.
Yeah.
So Democrats across the country are now using this to mobilise voters. So in terms of elections this year, we've got Ralph Northam in Virginia saying that he will defend women's rights. Now, Virginia at the moment, I believe, is not only does it have a Democratic governor, I think it's actually got Democratic majorities in both houses.
It does, yes, it does.
Yeah, it's moved to a trifecta. So there's no danger of a law like this happening in Virginia, even if there is a danger in many other states across the country. But nonetheless, so important is this issue that Democrats believe, and I think they might be right, that this is something that could mobilise voters who otherwise might not be terribly enthusiastic about the voting in the year of our Lord 2021. So as in California as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later, Gavin Newsom is talking about the fact that he will defend women's rights. California is another place that currently, although who knows, after the recall election, has a trifecta. So there's no danger of the law actually happening here. And it's been pointed out that there was historically a really asymmetric motivation on this issue, because pro-choice people always believed that efforts to overturn Roe versus Wade weren't going to come to anything. And you can see why that's the case, given how long overturning Roe versus Wade has been a cause, resulting in nothing, almost the extent that some people believe that right-wingers strategically wouldn't want to win on this issue, because it would then deprive them of a mobilising issue. But it's certainly been a mobilising issue on the pro-life side, because it is there to be won, it is there to be overtaken, and because it has become such an important issue dividing the two parties. So it's really asymmetric because of the fact that the pro-choice side believed that Roe versus Wade was fundamentally safe. Now that the dog has actually caught the car, with the Supreme Court having a conservative supermajority, now that it doesn't look like that Roe versus Wade is safe anymore, that actually changes the motivation. It potentially makes the motivation a lot more even than it used to be. And so Democrats have recognised this as being the kind of issue that can mobilise Democrats even in elections where it's not actually at stake.
That is definitely the case. It's, as you say though, it's very hard to know exactly how it's going to play and where when you balance these kinds of considerations, because it's hard to poll that kind of stuff. Like when you poll, you just know what someone thinks. You don't know how passionately they think it. You don't know how much it controls their vote and how much it controls their turnout in particular. For those who are interested, by the way, I'll put up in the homework, which is, by the way, where you can find the book that Dr. Dave referred to before, his reading list. That will keep you going all pandemic, I promise you. That's up in the blurb, in the Facebook video, and in the YouTube video. If you just click on the blurb, you'll see all this. In the homework, I'll put a link to a NBC poll of every single state and where they stand on abortion, every single state, and also every single demographic. which is, once again, not going to say, it's not going to tell us what Dr. Dave was just referring to. We don't know the passion, but at the very least, it'll give us more information than national numbers. We always throw around national numbers. When, a state, for instance, a state like Florida, from memory, they are, I think, 56% who say Roe versus Wade shouldn't be overturned. I think it's 56%. And that's a state where undoubtedly they're going to try and pass a similar kind of law.
Because the national average is what, 60%, right?
It's 58%, yeah.
58%,
yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, so it makes sense Florida would be slightly below that.
Yeah. So anyway, so I'll put that up there. I'll skip all the national polling for exactly the reason I just said. I mentioned some of it in the show anyway.
Let's skip polling altogether for the rest of our lives.
An argument that gets thrown around a lot in this kind of debate, though, and this is something that's getting thrown around right now, is the right try to nail you down on when does life begin. Like that's what they try and say. They try and make the argument about whether life begins at conception or not. And in particular, they try and do that because Democrats, especially squeamish Democrats and moderate Democrats, really don't like. They're all over the place on this kind of question. In fact, Joe Biden himself is all over the place with himself, like at different times. In 2012, during the vice presidential debate, he explicitly said, life begins at conception in the church's judgment. I accept it in my personal life. Now he says, I respect people who don't support Roe versus Wade. I respect their views. Those who believe life begins at the moment of conception and all. I respect that. Don't agree, but I respect that. Okay, so he's changed his position there. But this kind of issue, what I would love to see, personally, I don't think you're going to disagree with me on this either, but we'll see. I'd like to see people just say, life begins at conception, but that's not relevant. Like,
I agree.
Like an abortion is killing something that's living. Yes, it's living.
I agree.
But we kill a lot of things that are alive.
Yes. This is the problem I've always had with this framing of when does life begin. That's not the issue.
No.
The issue is, when does that collection of cells become a human being? And that is not actually a question to which there is a scientific answer. That is always unavoidably going to be a moral question that people are going to answer in different ways.
I agree with that, but I'd take it even further, because it's not just that we kill a lot of things that aren't considered human beings, and when do we consider this a human being? But also we kill a lot of people. We kill people in wars. We kill people in prison. We kill people indirectly in our society, the way it works. We kill a lot of people, and we're okay with that. And so different people have different lines when it's okay to kill people. And so I think that it's, as you say, a moral question of that society has to make for itself, it has to answer for itself. What is it okay, according to us, to kill, and when can we kill it? What are the circumstances? That's the question. Like, it's not, are you killing something? Yes, of course you're killing something. But is it okay or is it not? That's the question society has to answer. And I wish they would frame it like that. It's a much more mature way to frame it than this stupid gotcha. But is there a heartbeat? But is there I find that disconcerting. They try and make it scientific. What isn't? It's clearly not scientific.
The science is on their side. No, it's absolute rubbish.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The only other thing I'd say about this is religious freedom. I think is an interesting one here. It's often used cynically, religious freedom arguments, to just get something that you want to happen. Sometimes it's used as a troll. Like I played a clip from the Satanists. Actually, I won't play it to you now, Dave, but I'll play it to the people at home now.
As an expression of our deeply held beliefs, the Satanic Temple has created a religious ritual that involves terminating an unwanted pregnancy during the first trimester. The ritual provides spiritual comfort and affirms bodily autonomy and self-worth. The Satanic Temple proudly announces to all of its followers that within the states that have enacted the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, religiously performed abortions are exempt from legal requirements that are not medically necessary. These include waiting periods, being forced to listen to the fetal heartbeat, forced burial or cremation of fetal remains, required reading materials, compulsory counseling, medically unnecessary sonograms, and the requirement that practitioners withhold certain medical information. The Satanic Temple will do all it can to assure that states protect the religious rights of our members to attain first trimester abortions on demand.
Now that's a troll, what the Satanists just did then, a clear troll. But for real, I read an interesting piece, I'll put it in the homework, you can read it for yourself, from a rabbi who was arguing that under Judaism, it's not at all clear where they stand when it comes to abortion under their religion. And the quote he said is, Judaism is neither pro-life or pro-choice. It depends on the life and it depends on the choice, which is an interesting way of putting it. It's quite sensible, really. But that is a religious freedom issue in a state which supposedly elevates religious freedom above everything else. And so I'll be interested to see how that plays out, because it's only an issue for red states. Both the religious freedom and the abortion issues are red state issues. So I'll be interested to see about that. The final thing I'd say about this, and see if you have anything else to add, Dave, is there's another law that started in Texas on September 1. Didn't get much coverage. Texans can now carry firearms in public without a license or a background check or training of any kind whatsoever. As of September 1. That slipped past, didn't it?
I'm surprised that wasn't already the law.
Yeah, I suppose. I just find that amazing. No training whatsoever. You can just go and buy a gun. All yours.
Have they named that law after the St. Louis couple?
the McCloskeys.
The poster children of, you shouldn't know how to handle a gun, just if you want to have one in public.
You know,
just go for it. Point it at whatever you want.
You know he's running for Senate, McCloskey.
Oh, Jesus.
Of course he is. Of course he is. Anyway. Do you have anything else to say about abortions, Dave, before we move on? Okay. Stats Nugget. This is a real quick one. In 2021, America experienced, get this, a 45% drop in the poverty rate, from 13.9% to 7.7%. That's 3 times the record drop over the last 50 years. So there we go. That's something you don't hear much. It's almost like giving people money.
Exactly.
Stops them being poor.
Amazing.
Who would have thought? Dave, you foreshadowed before the California recall. Talk to us about that.
Yes. Yeah. So there is a recall election happening in California on Tuesday, September the 14th. And I just want to note from the outset that California has this really outsized role in the American political imagination. Okay, so it's, I think about 1 in every 8 Americans lives in California. It's got a population of about 40 million people. If it was its own country, it'd be the 37th largest country on earth. If it was its own economy, it would be the 5th largest economy on earth. And in 2021, what California signifies is liberal or left wing. And that's been the case for a while. So in 2016, you often heard people make the argument that, well, if it wasn't for California, Trump would have won the popular vote. You know, if you could somehow exclude the part of America that 1 in every 8 Americans live in, Trump would have won the popular vote. You also hear the argument, whenever you hear people trying to defend the Electoral College, they always invoke California. They say, well, if it wasn't for the Electoral College, then California would just rule the country, you know, and candidates would only ever go to California, which is, that falls apart on like a second of actually thinking about it. But anyway, California bashing is extremely popular because of its allegedly excessive liberalism. However, first of all, this was not always the case, right? California is where both Nixon and Reagan came from, and California strongly supported both Nixon and Reagan. Orange County is basically the birthplace of the modern American right. And until fairly recently, Southern California was still a Republican stronghold, even if Northern California was not. San Diego, until recently, was, you know, one of the last major cities in America where a Republican could be elected mayor. I like the fact that the airport in Orange County is John Wayne International Airport. John Wayne, like Ronald Reagan, a stalwart of right-wing Hollywood. Hollywood is another thing that's often incorrectly stereotyped as excessively liberal or left-wing. You know, there may be a lot of liberal and left-wing actors, but there's a lot of right-wing actors and producers and writers as well. And it's actually quite hard to find a Hollywood movie that isn't sort of enthusiastically supportive of the consensus in United States foreign policy. So this picture of California as just, you know, irredeemably liberal or left-wing has always been pretty inaccurate. And it is worth remembering Trump got the most votes from California of any state in the country. He got 6 million votes in California. That's more than he got in Texas, more than he got in Florida. Now, sure, because California's so big, that was only 34% of the vote, which is his fourth worst showing in the country. But still, you know, there were 6 million Trump voters in California. And this brings us to the question of why Democrats have actually been a little bit worried about this recall election of Gavin Newsom. So recall elections, for those of you not familiar with them, they exist in many parts of the country and they allow public officials to be recalled in years that are not election years. The unique thing about California is that because there are so many institutions of direct democracy in California, California is one of the places where you can get a governor recalled. They don't have to have done anything illegal. You just need to get enough petitions on a ballot. And that magic number is 12% of the people who voted in the last election. There have been recall attempts, Chads, on every California governor since 1968. I believe that Ronald Reagan was the last one who nobody actually attempted to recall, although it's not very often that you actually get to that 12% number. In a state as big as California, that's a big effort. So, as always...
Sorry to interrupt. I just say the only reason they even got to it this time was because under COVID, they extended the period to be a couple of extra months.
That is absolutely right. Yeah. So, you know, as always, there was a recall campaign taking place. Mainly, it started out sort of basically objections to the way that Newsom handled the pandemic. And to be fair, he hasn't handled the pandemic particularly well. But if you're going to recall everybody who's handled the pandemic badly, that's pretty much everybody. You know, there might be a couple of tiny exceptions. But anyway, what really got the recall effort over the line, do you remember this incident? It was when he was found... At the same time he's telling everyone in California to stay at home, he went to a dinner for a wealthy fundraiser at a restaurant in Napa Valley called French Laundry. And so this really accelerated momentum around the recall effort. But just doing a bit of research on this, one of the favourite things that I found out about it was that the leader of Recall Gavin, the movement that put the petition together, is named Randy Economy.
Randy Economy?
Randy Economy. That's not a pseudonym that's referring to the San Fernando Valley's porn industry. That's his actual name, is Randy Economy. Okay, so the recall election is going to happen. Now, under California's weird ballot structure in a recall election, what happens is there are two questions. The first is, should the governor be recalled? If the governor gets more than 50% of people saying no, the governor survives. But then the second question is, if you do want to recall the governor, which candidate are you going to choose? Now, there are 45 candidates on this ballot, okay? There are no Democrats running, or no major Democrats running.
There's a few YouTube Democrats, but not real Democrats.
Yeah, the effort is instead behind getting Newsom re-elected or not recalled. In fact, the Newsom team has refused to endorse anybody else on the ballot. And there are debates about whether that's strategically wise, but anyway, that is the case. So what that means is... and especially given that a lot of the people who vote no aren't going to then say, oh, yeah, but if he does get recalled, I want this guy. So instead, what it comes down to is basically a fight between all of these right-wing... I mean, there are progressive candidates on the ballot as well, but essentially a fight between all of these right-wing candidates. Now, there are 45 of them. Most of them are not well known at all. sort of the most establishment candidate on there is Kevin Faulconer, the former Republican mayor of San Diego. There was a reason why I mentioned that San Diego was one of the few places a Republican could get elected mayor. But it's become very clear that if Newsom gets recalled, there is one candidate who is clearly going to replace him, getting 24% currently in polling, is right-wing radio personality Larry Elder.
Yep.
Do you know much about Larry Elder?
Not a huge amount, to be honest.
Yeah, so Larry Elder, African-American, Los Angeles native, and major libertarian, right? And throughout most of his career has been a very consistent libertarian. So he's famous for saying that the minimum wage should be $0.00. Also for wanting to legalise drugs, you know, the complete sort of suite of libertarian things. And he's got a very loyal radio following. And he's often been asked, you know, when are you running for governor? And he's basically always said no, because he's like, no party is going to accept me with these views. Now, the Libertarian Party might have accepted him, but I think he's wise enough to understand that that would have been a waste of time. But this recall election has sort of opened up this political space for Larry Elder, who has the advantage of name recognition because he is a well-known radio personality in Southern California. So Larry Elder is leading it. And in fact, Democrats have decided he is basically their best asset for keeping Newsom in power, because Democrats, let me tell you, were worried about this. Okay, they actually were quite nervous, despite the fact that Newsom had won the state by 27 points in the last gubernatorial election, despite the fact that Biden won the state by 28 points. They were worried about him because of asymmetric motivation, right? There are 6 million Trump voters in the state, and there would be a lot of them fired up to get rid of Newsom because of his stance on the pandemic. Now, there is a very good reason that Newsom should be recalled, and that is he was married to Kimberley Guilfoyle, right? Now, I would vote to recall him for that reason if the alternative wasn't Larry Elder, because Larry Elder is against any possible measure you could imagine to deal with the pandemic. You can forget mandates of any kind. You can forget mask mandates. You can forget mandatory vaccine for healthcare workers, which is very popular in California by a 2-to-1 margin. California is already an eternal fiscal basket case because of that direct democracy I was talking about, which included a referendum in the 70s that said if you ever want to raise taxes again, you have to go to a state referendum about it. Surprisingly, taxes have never been raised since the 1970s in California either. God knows, I mean, Larry Elder would only be in charge for a year, but God knows what he would do during that period.
I'll tell you what he'd do. What he'd do is if Dianne Feinstein died, which is so on the cards, he'd replace her with a Republican, and there would go control of the Senate.
That is absolute. He has said that this is what he would do, right? So now we're actually seeing, I think, at a couple of weeks ago, basically the polling was within the margin of error, right? It was 52 to 48.
Yeah, all the polls have been going up for Newsom. Like he's now, it's looking like it's kind of a 53-ish kind of situation now, which is a smaller margin it seems, because remember he's got to get more than 50. So it's not comfortable. I mean, the point you made before about the concern that the Democrats had was very real because even the Democrats don't particularly love Gavin Newsom. No. So when the situation is, hey, save Gavin Newsom, a lot of Democrats go, oh, whatever. But when it's, do you want Newsom or do you want this talkback dude who's going to hand the Senate over to the Republicans? Then all of a sudden they get interested. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also, not surprisingly, very anti-abortion as well.
Yeah.
His positions on some things have changed, such as whether Joe Biden won the election.
Yes.
Actually said very shortly after the election, Joe Biden won the election. And then, profiles encourage here, when he saw which way Republicans were actually going on this issue, said, oh no, I want a mulligan on that. There have been a lot of issues with voter integrity. And now, whenever he goes to a rally anywhere, Dave Weigel in the Washington Post has been doing some very good reporting on this. Basically, it's just him constantly dealing with questions about, what are you going to do to stop the steal? What are you going to do to stop Democrats cheating? That's my impression of an Orange County Republican activist.
To be fair, though, I think that this is a great summary you've just given, but I feel like you've been very unfair to the suite of options available to Californian voters, because it's not just Larry Elder. Like you've also got this dude.
You remind me of the guy in high school who took my girlfriend, then went on to the next school. You still think you're better than everyone else. You shut down public schools while your kids went to private school. Even now you live by different rules. You closed tiny coffee shops while you ate dinner at the fanciest restaurant. $12,000 for wine. You've lost touch with reality. This is not about political parties. It is about you, Gavin Newsom.
Recall Newsom. Bring us together.
Is this an ex-boyfriend of Kimberley Guilfoyle?
I don't know. I tell you what, if this guy went out with Kimberley Guilfoyle before Gavin Newsom, she really traded up. That's all I'm going to say.
Wait, wasn't Caitlyn Jenner on the ballot?
At one point in time, Caitlyn Jenner was the favourite before Elder took over. Caitlyn Jenner was the favourite.
Caitlyn Jenner is currently in Australia doing Celebrity Big Brother.
Yeah, this is a bit back. Yeah, like this was a few months back. Caitlyn Jenner was the favourite, and then she decided to take the check from Big Brother to be in the house and just.
Wow! Imagine that. Imagine choosing Australian Big Brother over the recall election.
Yeah.
That's quite a choice.
I feel in a way that really earned her election. I feel like she represented the people more than any of these other people have by choosing Australian Big Brother over the recall election. But it's not to be, unfortunately. She's done now. Do you have anything else to say about California before we move quickly on to COVID?
I think I'm all California'd out.
Okay. I'm going to roll through this rapidly until you need to go, which is not far away. I know you don't like polls, but I'll just throw it out there. I did mention this on the show as well. I think it's significant. No, I hate the word significant. I think it's worth noting. YouGov has Biden now at 42% approval on COVID. 42 to 46. He's underwater on COVID. Until very recently, that was his lifeboat, COVID. It was in the high 60s. Sometimes it was in the 70s. He's now underwater. So obviously the Delta is starting to take a bite. And you can tell he's trying to press every button he can. I mentioned this on the show, so I'm not going to go into detail here. But do you know the story about the FDA with booster shots? About they set a date, September 20, when they were going to bring out booster shots for a third shot booster shots for people. Then there was and Fauci was making noises about it. There were rumblings, little leaks about it, and then two people from the FDA resigned because they said this is all political. This is not being pushed by the FDA. And they basically accused the administration of political interference. And people go, well, this is interesting. And then that was a week ago. Then 2 days ago, they pushed back the date to the indefinite because they said Moderna still hadn't even handed in their data about third shots. And Pfizer, they hadn't even had the administrative meeting about it either. Pfizer had handed in their shots, but they hadn't even had the conference about it. And they set this date weeks ago when there was no data and there was nothing. And so I think it's a fair accusation that there was a bit of political interference here. Obviously, they're panicking about Delta. And the third shot boosters are having success in Israel as well, I should say. But nevertheless, I have to say, I didn't say this on the show, but I don't normally do this. I reckon if this was the Trump administration that happened, that would be a bigger story. That would be a much bigger story. That two people from the FDA resigned, accusing them of political interference with vaccine science. And then it turned out that they had tried to push something through before they even got the data about it. I think that's not good. And I just want to in the end, the science has won over. They have backed down, but I just want to put out there that is not a great way to run an administration. So I think it's worth acknowledging.
I think in public opinion terms, the collapsing approval rating on the pandemic, that's not about any kind of policy lever at all, including that. That's just about the numbers.
Yeah, no, I understand. I agree. And more than numbers, what the numbers represent. Because in Idaho, I don't know if you heard this, in northern Idaho hospitals, we're seeing the first time in this entire pandemic where American hospitals are actually implementing what they call crisis standards of care, which is rationing, which is sorry, COVID person, you have to die. They're actually doing it now because their hospitals are full. There are too many people to airlift. They're sorting people in terms of how much they are likely to respond to treatment. The people who are most likely to respond to treatment are going to get the treatment. The other people are getting palliative care. And if they die, they die. Yeah. That's where they're at, unfortunately. And that's the kind of thing that really changes people's views about a pandemic, I would have thought. When you start getting that kind of thing, when you start actually saying goodbye to grandma when she could be fixed, when she could be cured, potentially, if they had the beds, but they don't have the beds. And then the people who have higher chances of surviving are just told to wait. That's the situation in northern Idaho at the moment. The whole vaccine situation is obviously a bit of a mess. America is now out of the top 45 countries for full population, for a fully vaccinated percentage of the population, even though they were the first to start. There's a few studies here I might just hold on to. Look at the clock there. Interestingly, what a Washington Post ABC poll, 17% of adults are now vaccine hesitant, which is a lot lower than it has been in the past. That number is starting to drop, so that's good news. It dropped from 32% in January, 24% in April. Probably the FDA approval of Pfizer might have helped with that. Maybe also just the seriousness of the pandemic at the moment.
Yeah, I think that the Delta strain has knocked a lot of hesitancy on its head.
Yeah.
And we have to remember, hesitancy is hesitancy. Yeah. Hesitancy is a state of uncertainty.
Yeah,
and
it doesn't mean they won't get it necessarily.
Yeah, because I think that, the number of outright refusers might also have grown during that period. But fortunately, it's the number of acceptors that has grown a lot faster.
Yeah. And support for vaccine mandates is also building accordingly for the same reasons, undoubtedly. According to Gallup, favouring vaccine requirements to dine in restaurants gone from 40 to 53% in the last few months. Staying in hotels gone from vaccine requirements for staying in hotels gone from 44 to 53%. Vaccine requirements for travelling by airplanes gone from 57 to 61%, and so on. The real interesting dark horse, which I've mentioned briefly, but there's more numbers on it now, is insurance, health insurance. Because insurers are not required to cover regular testing unless medically necessary. What that means is, if you're one of those people who's unvaccinated, who has to get constant tests to monitor you, you have to pay for it. $200 a pop for routine screenings. That adds up, right? You don't get it on insurance. Also, a Guise survey found 72% of large health plans are no longer making COVID treatment free for all patients. In particular, their treatment coverage only applies to the vaccinated and people who get sick with a breakthrough infection and children under 12. So you're taking a risk if with your insurance, if you're unvaccinated, of the average hospitalisation costs $40,000 and is longer, and it's more expensive for lengthy stays, for transported stays, for ICUs. They won't pay all of that, obviously, but the average cost could be 10 grand or more. That's quite a price to pay for a shitty little diagnosis if you could have got the vaccine. So that could be a factor as well going on. You have to go now, don't you?
Yes, on that note, I have to go. Good night, Dayton. I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Dave. See you next week. I'll continue with you guys for 5 more minutes and then we'll wrap up, as always. The other things I'd say about COVID is that some interesting studies, which I think you guys would be interested in. First of all, this is a CDC study. The percentage of COVID-19 emergency room visits in August 2021 in the quartile of states with the lowest vaccination coverage. Okay, so the lowest vaccination coverage, the emergency room visits were 3.4 times as many as the quartile of states with the highest vaccination coverage. Also, the rate of general hospital admissions in August 2021 in the quartile of states with the lowest vaccination coverage was 3.7 times that of the quartile of states with the highest vaccination coverage. So that tells us what we already know. Obviously, vaccinations make a huge difference. But this is interesting. The proportion of those hospital patients admitted to an ICU under this study during the pre-Delta period, which is March 2020 through to June 2021, is basically the same as the proportion of hospital patients admitted to an ICU in the Delta period between June 20 and now. It's 26.5% versus 23.2%, basically the same. So what that tells us is that Delta doesn't make you any sicker. If you get sick, whether it's Delta or the Alpha strain, you're just as likely to get really sick, at least according to this CDC study. So that's good news at least, if you're vaccinated. For everyone else, you can see Idaho. The other things here, interesting thing here on that Washington Post poll before about the vaccine mandates I mentioned. If there was a workplace vaccine mandate, only 16% of unvaccinated workers said they would get the shot if required for their job. Number one, I don't believe that. But also, 16% is a lot of unvaccinated people. So that may be something that some workplaces will consider, we'll see. I mentioned insurance. Masks. Oh yeah, some interesting... I mentioned a study last week on last week's show, which I want to go into more detail with here. It was about masks. It was a study from Bangladesh. It was a randomised mask study with cotton masks, surgical masks, and the control group. 340,000 people in this study across 600 villages, okay? So this is a real good study. And it was top quality process. They first took the blood from every single person in this study, 340,000 people, okay? Then they began encouraging mask wearing amongst half of the population, handing out free masks, offering info on the importance of masking, getting community leaders to set an example by masking up, even performing in-person reminders for 8 straight weeks. Okay, so they went through all the processes that you would try to do to encourage mask wearing for that half. And then they observed exactly how many people were wearing masks in each village. They sat and watched. It wasn't a survey. They observed the percentage that were wearing masks. And then, and by the way, it was 42% wearing masks in the mask wearing half, 13% wearing masks in the control group. Then they measured the villagers' blood again. So what that did was that excluded all the people who had had COVID in the past. They only looked at the people who got COVID during that 8-week period in the study. Brilliant research technique here. Like there was just no doubt they knew exactly the number of people who got COVID, even without symptoms. They knew exactly who got COVID from their blood. They knew exactly who wore masks from their observations. Perfect process. So no surveys, all facts, no confusion. They found an 11.9% reduction in COVID-19 symptoms from the control villages. Okay, the control villages had an 11.9%. Sorry, just to be clear, the people with the masks had an 11.9% reduction in COVID-19 symptoms as compared to the control villages. Sorry. And we even know how the different masks went. Cotton masks had an 8.5% reduction. Surgical masks had a 13.6% reduction. So the surgical masks work better than the cotton masks, but the cotton masks work better than nothing. Great, great study. Best proof of masks I've seen. Interestingly, the age was critical to the effect of masks. Age 60 plus had a 34.7% reduction in symptoms from the people who wore masks to the people who didn't. 50 to 60 had a 23% reduction in symptoms. But 40 to 50 and younger than that had no statistically significant reductions, which doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't wear a mask if you're under 50, because remember, the mask stops you spreading it to other people. So the reason you're wearing a mask is not to stop you getting it, it's to stop other people getting it. So it's actually more important that you wear the mask to stop the old people getting it from you, if that makes sense. Note, though, as well, that was the impact from only 42% of people wearing masks to 13% of people wearing masks in the control group. There was only, 29% difference in mask wearing, and that made that much of a difference. So maybe if the whole population was wearing masks, it would make a difference to the young. Maybe it would. Maybe it would make more difference to the old. So mandates might be particularly effective against the old, or they might help the young. We don't know. Or maybe as well, young people had. Oh no, sure, we'll leave that. It's going to take too long. The fact is, we don't know the details of a lot of this kind of stuff, but we do know enough to know that cotton masks work in some capacity, and surgical masks work better. Anyway, but my point is, this is the best study ever, and even that study was inconclusive about kids wearing masks. I think we think it makes a difference, but it's hard to get really good evidence on this. Also, that was before the Delta strain, I should say, that study. It was between November and April. Okay, anyway, people get very protective about their kids, though, when it comes to masking. I'll play a clip here.
Men, I need you in the coming weeks, because when we walk into those school boards, we're going to have everything we need to do to go in there with those 9 school boards that voted to put these masks back on the children with no scientific. It's done giving them the research and the data. Do you understand that? Forget going into these school boards and bringing data. You go into school boards to remove them. That's what you do. Forget. They don't follow the law. You go in and you remove them. I'm going in with 20 strong men. I'm going to speak in front of the school board, and I'm going to give them an option. They can leave or they can be removed. And then after that, we're going to replace them with nine parents, and we're going to vote down the mask mandates that evening. That evening. This is how you get stuff done. Forget writing your legislators. Forget it. They're not listening. You got to do something. It's us. It's we the people.
That guy there was the Northampton County Executive candidate, Steve Lynch, talking about going to a school board and, well, enacting his name out on them, pretty much, Steve Lynch. I'm not sure that's an encouraging development, but it plays into what we already know about America, and it's more fucked up than any other country. There was a Pew poll, just about out of time here, but there's a Pew poll about who thinks there have been too many restrictions during COVID. It was really interesting. I'm not interested in the raw numbers here, just the difference between the left and the right. It really shows how partisan America is. Australia, there was 21 points difference between the left and the right. Greece, there was 21 points difference between the left and the right. Remember, this is a difference between those who say there were too many restrictions during COVID. Germany, 20 points difference between the left and the right. Italy, 17 points difference between the left and the right. Canada, 17 points difference between the left and the right. Spain, 15 points. New Zealand, 12 points. Netherlands, 11 points. South Korea, 11 points. Sweden, 7 points. America, 45 points difference between the left and the right. America is so much more partisan than any other place on everything, and especially COVID restrictions. Interestingly, by the way, as a little aside, Greece was the other way round than all the other countries. 55% of the left said there were too many restrictions, and 34% of the right said there were too many restrictions. The right wanted more restrictions. I guess the government there is, I assume, of the left. I don't know. Anyway, it's interesting. And like I mentioned on the show last week, when you have a situation like this where people are worked up about restrictions and there's partisan issues, the easiest way to support kids who don't have vaccinations is, get them to wear a mask, sure, at school, but the easiest way is just for you to get vaccinated. I mentioned this study on the show last week from Israel. For every extra 20% of adults vaccinated, the share of children with COVID falls by a half. That's an easy way to support the kids. And one more issue that's kind of been forgotten. Researchers from the University of Southern California and University of Michigan found children aged between 5 and 11 who were overweight or obese rose from 36% pre-pandemic to nearly 46% in less than a year. Now that we don't hear enough about. That's not about being yes, it helps. Part of the reason is because they're locked down, but also they're not doing enough exercise even when they are locked down. That's something that people should be focused on. And yeah, for people who are at home at the moment in New South Wales or Victoria, look at your own kids, because going up 10% in obesity in like 6 months. I know I've porked up a bit. Anyway, I'm out of time, so I don't have time to talk about Joe Rogan, but I want to talk about Joe Rogan at some point in time, because he's like the ivermectin thing with him. I'm not worried about the ivermectin thing with him. He took human ivermectin. He didn't take horse paste. But he did say something that bothered me, and I want to talk about that next time we talk about COVID. Thank you so much, guys. I will see you next week. Bye.